The rain had been falling since the afternoon, and by the time evening settled over the village of Thornhollow, it had become the kind of rain that did not merely fall, but descended with intention. A slow, deliberate curtain of water drawn across the hills, the cobblestones, the shingled rooftops, and the winding river that cut like an old scar through the valley below. It was the kind of rain that invited people indoors, the kind that made fireplaces seem like living things, breathing, warm, necessary, the kind that asked nothing of anyone except that they be still. In the eastern wing of the old Whitmore estate, on the second floor, in a room that smelled of cedar wood and old books, and the faintly metallic tang of the radiator that clanked in the corner, a woman named Elara sat wrapped in a wool blanket at the wide window bay and watched the rain streak down the glass. She was 34 years old. She had gray eyes the color of the sky on days exactly like this one. She wore her dark hair loose over her shoulders. She had a cup of chamomile tea she had forgotten to drink, and it had gone cold on the small table beside her, and she had not noticed, or perhaps had noticed and had not minded. She had arrived at the estate 3 days ago. She was not sure why she had come, or rather, she knew the practical reasons, the invitation from her old friend Delia, the need for rest, the city apartment that had started to feel like a jar she was too large for. But she was not sure about the reasons underneath the practical reasons, the ones that moved through the body like weather patterns, unseen and undeniable, the reasons that made a person pack a bag on a Thursday afternoon and drive 4 hours north into the hills as the first cold fingers of autumn began to press themselves against the season. The Whitmore estate had been in Delia's family for 3 generations. It was not grand in any intimidating sense, but it was large and full and old in a way that certain buildings became old, not decrepit, but layered, like a sedimentary rock that had pressed years feathers into its own body and kept them. The staircase creaked in a particular pattern that Alara had already learned. First step silent, second step a low moan, third step a sharp crack that echoed. The dining room had paintings of people who had once mattered very much to someone, and now mattered only as decoration. The kitchen was enormous and slightly chaotic, and always smelling of something good. There were other guests at the estate this weekend. There was Delia herself, tall, warm, perpetually in motion, the kind of woman who managed a large gathering with the same energetic ease she brought to everything else. There was Marcus, Delia's husband, who was quiet and thoughtful and made excellent coffee and asked interesting questions. There was Felix, a childhood friend of Delia's who lived in Edinburgh and visited twice a year and laughed easily and deeply. There was Nora, who was a painter and had brought 3 canvases and set them up in the garden conservatory and could be found at all hours staring at them with intense and unsatisfied focus. And there was a man named Oliver who had arrived that morning and whom Alara had not yet properly spoken to, though she had noticed him. She had noticed him the way one notices, whether not immediately with the conscious eye, but with something older and more instinctive. He was perhaps 40. He had the kind of face that was not symmetrically handsome, but was compelling in the way that asymmetrical things could be compelling. A crooked quality to the mouth, eyes that were set just slightly deep, a jaw that held tension even in repose. He had been standing in the library when she walked through on her way to the garden that morning, and he had been reading a book. He held the way people held books they genuinely loved, close, with both hands slightly tilted toward the light. She had not spoken to him. She had walked through the library and into the garden, where it had already been threatening rain, and had come back inside 20 minutes later, and he had been gone. And now It was evening, and the rain had arrived in earnest, and everyone had gathered in the long sitting room downstairs, except, it seemed, for Alara, who had come up to her room because she felt the onset of one of those moods that required solitude the way a fire required air. The rain knocked against the window glass with a sound like polite but persistent insistence. She watched a rivulet of water find its crooked way down the pane and disappear into the frame. She thought about nothing for a while, which was its own kind of luxury, the kind the city rarely offered. Then there was a knock at her bedroom door. She turned from the window. The room was lit only by the lamp on her nightstand and the gray ambient light from outside. And in that soft half-darkness, everything looked slightly theatrical, slightly heightened, like a stage set waiting for its actors to arrive. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and said, "Come in." The door opened, and it was Delia, barefoot despite the chill, her dark red hair piled untidily on her head, a glass of something amber in one hand, and a look of affectionate exasperation on her face. "You are hiding," she said. "I am resting," Alara said. "Those are not the same thing. They're adjacent." Delia crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, pulling her feet up beneath her in the cross-legged manner she had always sat since they were university students sharing a flat in Bristol. She looked at Alara's cold tea with the expression of someone solving a small domestic mystery. "You've been up here for 2 hours," she said. "Has it been 2 hours? Marcus is making that mushroom thing you like. Felix is telling stories." At the phrase "telling stories," something in Alara shifted. It was a small shift, like a compass needle turning. She had always been susceptible to stories. This was known, documented, a fact about her that the people who loved her understood and worked with. She read voraciously. She listened in the particular way of someone who was storing what they heard, filing it somewhere internal for later use. She had been told more than once that she was a good listener, and she accepted this compliment with appropriate modesty, while privately knowing that it was not entirely virtue. She was a good listener because she was constitutionally incapable of being otherwise. "What kind of stories?" she asked. Delia smiled, recognizing the shift. "You'll have to come down and see, won't you?" The sitting room was long and low-ceilinged, with dark paneled walls hung with maps of places that had been important to someone in the past and had since lost their urgency. The fire in the stone hearth was substantial and well-fed, throwing warm, unsteady light across the room. The rain was louder here, rattling at the tall windows that faced the western garden, and the sound of it made the room feel more enclosed, more intimate, like a cupped hand held against the world. Marcus had set up a cheese board on the low table and was in the kitchen attending to the mushroom dish. Nora had abandoned her canvases and was lying on the rug before the fire with a sketchbook open on her chest, making quick, loose drawings with a charcoal pencil. Felix was in the armchair to the left of the hearth, his long legs stretched before him, his hands moving as he talked, and Oliver was on the sofa to the right, his own glass held loosely in one hand, watching Felix with attention. Alara entered with Delia and settled herself in the other armchair, tucking her feet beneath her. The blanket had been left upstairs, and she accepted this as the trade warmth from the fire in exchange for the blanket's portable variety. Felix was in the middle of a story. He was one of those people who told stories well, not by performing them, not by gesturing elaborately or pitching his voice dramatically, but by giving them a kind of grounded specificity that made them feel as if they were happening just now, just here. He chose details with the instinct of someone who understood that the right detail was not the most obvious one, but the most true one. The particular angle of light, the specific word someone used, the smell of the room. He was telling a story about a woman he had known in Edinburgh, a neighbor who had lived on his street for 20 years, and whom he had passed on the pavement thousands of times without more than a nod. And then one morning she had stopped him and said something remarkable, something that had apparently shifted his understanding of what remarkable meant. He was building toward it, the details accumulating, the small, ordinary observations stacking themselves into something that had, Alara could already feel, a particular kind of weight. She listened. The fire crackled. The rain performed its patient percussion against the windows. Oliver was very still on the sofa, and she was aware of his stillness in the way she was sometimes aware of the presence of large, calm animals, horses, certain dogs, a stillness that was not absence, but attention. Felix finished his story. The room was quiet for a beat, which was the sign of a story that had done its work properly. Not a silence that required filling, but one that needed to be inhabited briefly before life continued. Then Oliver said, "That reminds me of something." His voice was lower than she had expected. There was a trace of something in his accent that she could not immediately place. Northern England, perhaps, smoothed down by years elsewhere. He said it simply, not as a bid for attention, just as the natural response of a person whose mind had made a connection and was following it. "Tell us," Delia said, drawing her knees up and wrapping both hands around her glass. It was the kind of invitation she extended effortlessly, the gift of good hosts, the clear, warm permission to continue. Oliver looked down at his drink for a moment, then out at the rain-dark windows, and then at the room generally, in the way of someone who was deciding where to begin, which was not the beginning of the story, but the beginning that made the story make sense, the two being different things. Then he said, "Do you know the story of the princess and the pea?" Of course, they knew the story. Everyone in the room knew the story. It was one of those stories that existed in the general cultural atmosphere, absorbed through childhood rather than actively learned. A prince looking for a real princess. The test of the pea hidden beneath 20 mattresses and 20 feather beds. The girl who could not sleep. The bruise. The proof. Hans Christian Andersen, 1835. Though the bones of it were older than Andersen by a long way, the bones going back to a category of tale as old as the category of tale itself. The question of how you recognize a true thing when you see it. "I know it," Alara said. She did not mean it as an interruption. She meant it as a kind of arrival, the confirmation that they were in a shared space. Oliver looked at her. It was the first time he had directly looked at her, and she found it had the quality of being looked at rather than simply noticed, which was a different quality entirely. His eyes were dark in the firelight. "Everyone knows it," he said, "but nobody talks about what it's actually about." "What is it actually about?" Nora asked from the rug, turning her head without sitting up, the charcoal pencil balanced on her fingers. Oliver leaned forward slightly, setting his glass on the low table. "It's about the problem of proof," he said, "about how impossible it is to prove an interior state to someone who doesn't want to take your word for it. The princess can feel the pea. She knows she can feel it. But the queen who designed the test, doesn't take her word for it. Can't take her word for it. The whole mechanism of the test is based on the premise that people lie or are mistaken about themselves or want something badly enough to say they are something they're not. So the test is designed to bypass the self entirely, to go around the question of whether the person is telling the truth, and instead ask the body. The fire popped. Outside, the rain shifted, a gust of wind bringing it harder against the western windows for a moment, and then subsiding. But that's also not satisfying, Elara heard herself say. As a logic, Oliver looked at her again. Why not? Because the test assumes that sensitivity is proof of authenticity. That being easily disturbed is the same as being genuine. But those aren't the same thing. Plenty of people are sensitive and dishonest. Plenty of people are genuine and thick-skinned. There was a small pause in the room, the pause that happened when a conversation shifted from pleasantly interesting to actually interesting. The gear change perceptible to everyone present. Felix had the look of a man watching something he was enjoying. Delia was watching Elara with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Oliver said, "You're right. The test is flawed as logic, but fairy tales don't operate by logic. They operate by something else." "What do they operate by?" Nora asked. "Emotional truth," he said. "Not what's literally true, but what feels true. And the thing that feels true in that story is not that sensitivity proves authenticity. You're right that it doesn't. The thing that feels true is the experience of the princess herself, the experience of being in a situation where you can feel something that others can't. That makes you seem difficult or precious or oversensitive. And not knowing if the problem is you or the situation. The room was quiet for a moment. In the kitchen, Marcus made a sound that was either curse or contentment, difficult to distinguish, and in either case private. That's a very particular experience, Felix said carefully, in the voice of someone recognizing something they were not sure they should name yet. "It is," Oliver agreed. He picked up his glass again. It's the experience of feeling something too much, of being informed by the people and structures around you, that your sensitivity is a defect, and then being vindicated by a test that, as she correctly points out, a small gesture toward Alara is logically dubious, which doesn't make the vindication less welcome. Later, Alara would try to identify the exact moment the evening became something other than a pleasant gathering of people in a comfortable room while rain fell outside. She would not be able to pinpoint it with precision. These moments did not announce themselves. They arrived already in progress, the way you sometimes became aware mid-sentence that a conversation had been important for longer than you had realized. What she was aware of, sitting in that armchair with the fire warm on her left side and the rain carrying on its steady work against the windows, was a quality of attention in the room that had sharpened beyond the comfortable attention of friends spending an evening together. Everyone had leaned in, or its emotional equivalent. Felix had stopped making the small adjustments of body language he made when he was comfortable, but not entirely engaged. Nora had set her sketchbook aside. Delia was very still, which Delia almost never was. Oliver was the kind of person, Alara realized, who said things that made the room more awake. Not because he performed or demanded attention, but because he was genuinely thinking, following a thought to wherever it led rather than redirecting toward safer territory. And the room could feel the difference. He told them the story the long way. The way you told a story when you understood that the story mattered, when you were not interested in efficiency, but in arrival. He went back before the beginning, as all good storytellers did. He said, "The original tale is older than Andersen, older than any single author or tradition. You find variations of it across cultures. The girl with perception, so acute it functions as suffering. The test designed by those in power to separate the genuine from the false. What Anderson did in 1835 was crystallize a version that has proven remarkably durable. But what he captured, I think, was not actually a fairy tale in the diminutive sense, not a story for children about a prince finding his princess. What he captured was a story about interiority, about what happens inside people that cannot be made visible to others. You're saying it's an epistemological problem, Felix said. I'm saying it's a human problem that epistemology is one way of describing. How do you know what another person is experiencing? You can't. You can only take their word for it, or devise tests, or observe behavior and make inferences. None of those methods are reliable. All of them are what we have. And the story, the specific story, the way Anderson tells it, is so brief, so stripped down. It goes directly to the nerve of the problem without dressing. The princess doesn't explain herself. The queen doesn't explain the test. The prince doesn't ask questions. The thing simply is what it is. Marcus came in from the kitchen carrying a large ceramic pot and a stack of bowls, navigating the room with the easy familiarity of a man who had been in this room hundreds of times and trusted it. He set things on the table and registered the quality of the room's attention and said nothing, simply settled himself on the edge of the sofa near Oliver and served himself quietly, the way a good guest at a theater would settle into their seat during a performance. Oliver paused while Marcus moved, the story waiting like a held breath. Then he continued, "What I've always found most interesting, and I'm telling you this the way I've thought about it, so you'll forgive me if it winds around, is the question of what the pea actually is. In the literal story, it's a legume. One dried pea placed beneath 20 mattresses and 20 eiderdown beds, as Anderson specifies. But in the story's logic, the pea isn't a pea. It's a metaphor that's been so well chosen it functions as itself. and as its meaning simultaneously. What is it a metaphor for? Alara asked. She was not asking because she didn't have an answer forming in her own mind. She did. She always did. Her mind moved toward questions the way a compass moved toward north. But because she wanted to hear how he would say it, Oliver looked at her steadily. The fire between them sent its unsteady light across both their faces. Outside, the rain had found a new rhythm, slower now, more deliberate, as if it too was listening. Sensitivity, he said, not as a personality trait, but as a mode of being. The capacity to register what others don't register, to feel the thing beneath the thing, and the ambiguity that comes with that, because sensitivity is both gift and liability. The princess cannot sleep on 20 mattresses. This is presented as the proof of her genuineness, but from another angle, it is also a problem. Most people could sleep on 20 mattresses. Most people would consider a person who could not sleep on 20 mattresses to have a problem. My ex-wife would have called it a disorder, Felix said. And there was just enough humor in it, and just enough truth in it, that the room gave a small, soft, not quite laugh. The sound of people recognizing a thing without wanting to amplify it. Your ex-wife isn't wrong from a practical standpoint, Oliver said. And there was something in the way he said it that was not unkind, but was precise, acknowledging the complexity. The practical world does not have room for people who can feel peace under 20 mattresses. It is not built for that level of sensitivity. But the story is making a different argument, or not even an argument, because stories that work don't argue. They propose. They show you a way of seeing and let you decide. And what this story proposes is that the sensitivity that makes you difficult is also the sensitivity that makes you real. Alara had picked up her mushroom dish at some point without entirely noticing, and was eating with the automatic attention of someone whose primary attention was elsewhere. The mushrooms were extraordinary. Marcus made them with something earthy and wine dark that she had never been able to identify and had stopped trying to. But she tasted them with the part of her mind that was not following Oliver's words. "I want to push back on something," she said. "Oh, please," he said, and meant it. "You're describing sensitivity as the real thing, as the mark of authenticity. But the story doesn't actually establish that. The story establishes that the Queen believes sensitivity is the mark of authenticity. The Queen designed the test. The Queen is the authority here. And queens have been wrong about things before." A small silence. "That's a more radical reading than I expected," Oliver said. "I'm not sure it's radical. I'm saying the story is more ambivalent than you're giving it credit for. You're reading it as endorsing the princess. I'm suggesting it might just be describing a world in which the princess is endorsed by someone with power. And that's a different thing. You're saying it might be a story about the arbitrariness of power rather than the reality of sensitivity. I'm saying it might be both at once, which is why stories that work keep working, because they hold several truths simultaneously, and different readers pull out different ones depending on where they're standing when they read. Oliver looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone making a small, quiet, internal revision, not conceding the point. It was not a debate. They were not arguing, but incorporating it, updating. She liked this in a person. She liked people whose thinking was visible, who did not defend their positions like territory to be held, but held them like tools to be set down and picked back up as needed. "You're right," he said, "both at once. At some point, the rain intensified again. Alara was not sure when, because she had stopped tracking the rain as a separate phenomenon, and it had become simply part of the atmosphere of the evening. woven into everything like the fire and the voices and the smell of the mushroom dish and the cedarand old book ambient scent that was the Whitmore estate's particular signature. Felix had taken the thread of the conversation and was talking now about a variation of the story he had encountered in a Scandinavian anthology, a version where it was not a pea but a single hair, and the test was designed not by a queen but by the young woman's own mother, who did not trust the prince's intentions and wished to determine whether her daughter was still the girl she had been before the world had a chance at her. The hair beneath the mattresses, the same logic, the same test of imperceptible sensitivity. That version is more interesting, Nora said from her returned position on the rug, now lying on her side and drawing the fire in quick strokes. Because the question of who administers the test changes the meaning. A queen testing for a princess is testing for class, for breeding, for the invisible refinement they believe only comes from a certain kind of upbringing. A mother testing for her daughter is testing for something else. She's testing for whether the girl still knows herself. Can you explain that? Delia asked. Nora set her charcoal pencil down and looked at the ceiling, which was her way of organizing thoughts that were still forming. When you go out into the world, specifically when you go out into a world that wants things from you, that shapes you, that tells you who to be, there's a risk. The risk is that you start to feel differently, that the sensitivity that was natural to you gets smoothed down by exposure, by accommodation, by the necessity of functioning in environments that aren't built for it. And you come home and you seem fine. You seem well and capable and adapted. But the question your mother is asking with the hair under the mattress is, can you still feel this? Are you still in there? The room was quiet. That's a different kind of bruise, Marcus said softly. He had finished his mushroom dish and was sitting with his elbows on his knees, his eyes on the fire. The prince's version is about finding someone. The mother's version is about not losing someone. The prince's version is about acquisition, Alara said. The mother's version is about continuity. Oliver was watching her. She was aware of being watched without turning to confirm it. The way you are sometimes aware of warm sunlight on your face without opening your eyes. It was not an uncomfortable awareness. It was precise, like the sound of a particular instrument becoming audible in a complex piece of music. In both versions, he said, picking the thread back up, the girl doesn't know she's being tested. That's always bothered me, Delia said. Why? Felix asked, genuinely curious. Because it means her participation in the proof of herself is involuntary. She's not given the opportunity to present herself on her own terms. The test happens to her, and the test speaks for her, and she never gets to say, "Here is what I am. Here is what I feel. Here is why I am what I claim." The test says it for her. And the test is someone else's design. I think that's the most uncomfortable part of the story, Oliver said. Not the pee itself, not the bruising, but the fact that she is made proof without her knowledge or consent. And yet, she passes. So, we are presumably meant to feel that justice was served. But whose justice? Not hers. She never asked to be tested. She never asked the test to speak for her. She asked to be let in out of the rain, Alara said, as everyone looked at her. That's the actual beginning, she said. She comes to the castle in a storm. A real storm, rain, lightning, thunder. Anderson is specific about this. She's soaked through. Her hair is plastered to her face. Water runs from her shoes. She is as far from the constructed image of a princess as it is possible to be while still being a person. And she knocks at the gate and says she is a princess. And then the entire apparatus of the story is set in motion. But all she actually wanted was to come in out of the rain. The fire gave a long, slow crackle, as if it had an opinion about this. "That's true," Oliver said. "That's exactly true. She didn't come looking to be tested," Alara continued. "She came looking for shelter. She came looking for rest. And instead, she got a test she didn't know she was taking, that she passed not by any act of will or intentional presentation of self, but by being so constitutionally sensitive that she couldn't sleep on a fabricated comfort and bruised in the night, and that bruise became her credential." "When you put it that way," Felix said slowly, "the story is much sadder than I've been thinking of it." "Or more familiar," Alara said. Marcus took away the dishes. Delia brought more wine. The fire was attended to and fed. Nora had begun a new sketch and showed it to no one, and this was accepted as normal. Outside, the rain had achieved the kind of steady, self-sustaining quality that suggested it would be there in the morning. It had stopped trying to impress anyone and had committed to its own endurance. They talked about stories. This was perhaps inevitable. It was the kind of night that made stories necessary, the kind of room that made them feel like the natural form of thought. They talked about the stories that had formed them, not the ones they would have cited in any literary-minded conversation as their favorites or their influences, the prestigious choices, but the ones that had gone in early and stayed, the ones whose logic had somehow become available to them for use in their own lives. Felix talked about Kipling's "The Man Who Would Be King," not the adventure elements, he said, but the specific quality of Daniel Dravot, the way he was genuinely regal until the moment he wasn't, the way the story examined the gap between the person who believed in themselves and the person who had cause to. Nora talked about a picture book she had encountered at age 6 that she had never been able to find again as an adult. A book about a girl who could hear colors, literally, synesthetically, in the story's logic, and was thought to be lying And the whole arc of the book was about the girl finding one person who believed her. And Nora said she thought the entire direction of her life had been set by that book. The specific emotional experience of it, the relief of being believed. Marcus talked about the Mahabharata, specifically about Karna, the warrior hero who was born of divine parentage and gave it away for principles and loyalty, and died with perfect dignity in the wrong story, in a story that had no proper place for someone with his particular combination of qualities. Karna, Marcus said, was a man who had a pea under every mattress and never once complained about the bruising, and died anyway because the bruising wasn't the point. Delia talked about Jane Eyre. Not the romance, she said, with the slight impatience of someone who had been required to have this clarifying conversation before. Not Rochester, Jane herself. The fact that her moral clarity is presented as extremism for most of the novel. The fact that she is poor and plain and governess class, and yet her account of her own interior life is treated by the narrative as the primary truth. The novel says, this woman's experience of herself is not subject to revision by those with more power or more beauty or more money. It simply is. It is the truth. And that, Delia said, is genuinely radical for 1847, and honestly still not fully accepted now. Then they looked at Oliver, because he had started the conversation, and there was a natural rounding back, a completion of the circle. Oliver was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the fire, and in his face was the look of someone not assembling an answer, but retrieving one, going somewhere internal and bringing something back. Mine, he said, is a story most people haven't read. It's called The Snow Child, but not the famous ones. There's an Eowyn Ivy novel. There's a Russian folk tale. There are several versions. The one I mean is a shorter piece. I read it in a collection of European folk stories when I was 12, and I've never been able to find the exact source. In this version, a couple in a cold northern country make a child from snow, a daughter. They pack the snow into the shape of a child and breathe life into her. And she is real. She is fully alive. She speaks and laughs and loves them. But she can only exist in winter. In spring, she has to go away, not die exactly, but dissolve, become snow again, return to where she came from. And every year she comes back when the cold comes. And every year they have her for the winter. And every year she leaves. The story is about what it means to love something seasonal. Something that is fully present and fully real, and also, by its nature, temporary. And whether temporary real love is better or worse than permanent absence, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Alara said, very quietly, "That's the saddest possible answer to the question." Oliver looked at her, and something in his face was open in the way that faces were open at certain late evening hours, when defenses came down not through intention, but through simple fatigue and warmth, and the accumulated small safety of a good conversation. "I know," he said, "but it's the true one." The evening moved through its natural stages. There was more wine, and then a switch to tea. Nora fell asleep on the rug in front of the fire, her sketchbook on her chest, rising and falling, and no one disturbed her because she looked correct there, like a detail that had been placed intentionally. Felix and Marcus drifted into a conversation about architecture. Marcus was an architect, and Felix had been thinking about redesigning something, and the conversation became its own private world. Delia sat beside Alara for a while and said nothing, which was one of the things Alara loved most about her. The capacity to simply be beside someone without requiring the space between them to be filled. Oliver had moved at some point from the sofa to the wide ledge of the stone fireplace, where there was a seat built into the chimney breast, old and probably original to the house, worn smooth by hundreds of years of people, sitting exactly where he was sitting now. He sat with his back against the stone and one knee drawn up, reading something on his phone with the muted and slightly guilty air of someone who had remembered they had a message to return. Alara watched the fire for a while. It had settled into the late stage of itself, not the dramatic early stage of height and drama, not the productive middle stage of steady heat, but the final stage of deeply settled coals and occasional small flames, the stage that was warmest and most intimate and required no more fuel, the stage that knew it was ending and was at peace with that. Around midnight, people began to disperse. Felix first, with a yawning announcement that he was old and his body had opinions. Then Delia and Marcus together, Delia pausing to touch Alara's shoulder as she passed, a small gesture that said several things at once. Marcus gently roused Nora, who woke with the disoriented dignity of someone who had been dreaming something important and was reluctant to return, and they persuaded her up the stairs. The room was empty except for Alara and Oliver. This happened without any particular drama or intention. It was simply the final configuration of the evening, arrived at by the natural subtraction of everyone else. The fire was almost out. The rain, she noticed, had finally relented. Or perhaps she was noticing its absence the way you sometimes noticed a sound only when it stopped. Oliver had put down his phone. He was watching the fire with the patient attention of someone who had decided to see it all the way through. He looked up when the room quieted and found her sitting across from him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The rain stopped, she said, about 10 minutes ago. Were you tracking it? It's the kind of thing I track. She looked at him properly. in the way that you could look at someone when the social density of the room had reduced to a level that permitted it. He was looking at her the same way. It was not an uncomfortable look. It had the quality of two people who had been in the same conversation all evening and were now in the quiet, having the conversation beneath the conversation. The one that had been running in parallel all night. The quieter and more personal current beneath the public flow of story and analysis and wine. The story you chose, she said. The Snow Child. Yes. Why that one? There are sadder stories. There are stories about loss that are more final, more catastrophic. A child who returns every winter is luckier than a child who doesn't return at all. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. The last small flame gave a slow pulse and settled into itself, because it's not a story about losing something. It's a story about choosing to love something that you know will leave. Every year they make the same choice. They could stop. They could pack the snow differently, make it harder to come together, refuse to breathe life into it. But they don't. They make the child every year. They accept the winter version of the love and the spring version of the loss. And there is something in that, the ongoing choice, that's different from a story about something taken from you. Alara considered this. Outside, through the windows where the rain had been, the clouds were beginning to break in the way that clouds broke after long rain, slowly revealing patches of dark sky. And occasionally, the pale edge of something that was probably the moon. Does the story tell us whether the parents are happy? She asked. No. Do you think they are? He turned to look at her, and in his face was the particular expression of someone being asked a question they had been asking themselves for a long time. I think, he said carefully, that the story is wise enough to understand that happiness might not be the right word for what they experience. I think what they experience is something more like fullness. The particular fullness of a life that has known a real and temporary thing, which is different from emptiness and different from happiness, and might be more durable than either. Alara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I came up here this weekend because I have been feeling like a jar that is too large for the things in it." He waited, which I understand is not the standard description, she said. Usually people feel too small for their lives, not too large. But what I've been feeling is a kind of excessive space. Things that used to take up room in me have resolved, or been resolved, or simply stopped. And the space they occupied is still there, but empty. And I don't know if that's grief or growth, or just the natural reduction of things that were never the right things to have kept. Oliver was very quiet and very still. The fire gave its final breath, a small, brief, complete exhalation, and went fully dark, and the room was now lit only by the lamp in the corner and the beginning moonlight at the windows. "I think," he said, "that might be exactly the right description of the pea." She looked at him. "The pea is the thing that tells you the space is there," he said, "not by filling it, by being too small to fill it, and yet managing to disturb everything anyway. The princess can't sleep not because the pea is large, but because she is sensitive enough to a small thing to be disturbed by it through 20 layers of comfort. And the question the story doesn't answer, the question I've always wanted it to answer, is whether the bruise in the morning is from the pea or from the mattresses. The pea didn't press into her, the mattresses, in response to the pea, did. The discomfort was distributed, and that distribution that might be the thing the story is most accurately describing, and the least often talked about. She had not expected to talk about her life. She had expected, if they talked at all with the room to themselves, a more theoretical conversation, the comfortable distance of story analysis. of literature as proxy. She was good at that distance. She had spent years being very articulate about things that were adjacent to the real things, and calling this intelligence when it was sometimes more accurately described as self-protection. But the evening had done something to the usual structures. The rain and the fire and the particular quality of the conversation, the way it had been from Oliver's first question about the princess and the pea, a conversation about interiority, about the problem of knowing and being known. All of this had done a slow, patient work on the structures, and she found herself at midnight with the fire out and the clouds opening over the garden, saying things she had not planned to say. She told him about the marriage. Not the whole thing, not the 7 years of it, not the careful architecture of what had been built, and what had been discovered over time to be built on less stable ground than either of them had understood. She told him about the end of it, which had not been dramatic, which had not involved betrayal or catastrophic failure, but rather a slow and mutual recognition, like two people on a long walk who stop at the same moment and look back and realize they have walked into different territories that happen to share a border, and the border is where they've been standing, and the question is which territory belongs to which person. He was a good man, she said. He still is. We are not friends exactly, but people who care what happens to each other, which I think is the best possible outcome of a thing like that. But, Oliver said, because the shape of what she was saying had a but in it, but he could not, would not. I don't want to make it a question of capacity. Feel the P. A silence. In the metaphorical sense, she added, though she thought it was clear. I understood, he said. There were things I was sensitive to that he simply wasn't. Not defective things, not disorders, not irrational fears or unfounded anxieties. Things in the atmosphere of the relationship, in the subtext of conversations, in the small accumulations of small days. I could feel them. He couldn't or didn't. And for a long time, I thought the problem was me, that my sensitivity was excess, that I was the princess complaining about the perfectly reasonable mattresses, that I should simply sleep and be grateful and stop perceiving things that weren't there. But they were there, Oliver said. They were there. They just weren't visible to him, which meant that trying to show them to him required a kind of translation that exhausted us both. And eventually, she paused, the way you paused when you were very close to the true version of a thing you'd been telling the approximated version of for a while. Eventually, I stopped trying to translate. I accepted the mattresses as reasonable, and something in me that had been bruised for years just accepted the bruise as permanent, which wasn't the same as not feeling it. The room was very quiet. Outside, the moon had fully emerged from the clouds, and the garden was visible now, wet and dark and silver lit. The grass holding the memory of the rain in its blade-level glitter. Oliver said nothing for a long moment. She appreciated this. There were people who filled silences immediately, who treated the other person's pauses as malfunctions to be corrected. And they meant well, but they made honesty difficult. He simply waited with the ease of someone for whom silence was not absence. Then he said, "The version of the story I keep coming back to is the one Anderson left ambiguous. He tells us she was a real princess because of the P, but he doesn't tell us what happens after the wedding. The story ends with the P in a cabinet of curiosities, where it may still be seen, he says. The princess and the prince are not described further. And I've always thought Anderson knew something. He knew that passing the test and being believed and getting the prince is not the end of the problem. The P is in a cabinet of curiosities. It has become an artifact. The sensitivity it proved has been institutionally acknowledged and then displayed as a wonder, and then put behind glass. does the princess do now that she's been proven and housed and married? Does she still feel things? Is there a pea under the royal mattresses? And if there is she permitted to mention it? Alara looked at him. Something in her chest had the feeling of a hand pressed flat against glass, not pushing, just the pressure of contact. That, she said, is the question nobody asks. No, he agreed. They ask about the test. They almost never ask about the after. He told her about himself obliquely, the way people told true things at late hours, not in the form of confession or narrative, but in the form of response. Each thing said, because the conversation asked for it rather than because there was a presentation to be made. He was an editor. Books, specifically literary fiction and essay collections. He lived in York. He had been married and then not married. He had a daughter who was 11 and who lived primarily with her mother, and whom he saw on weekends and holidays. And this arrangement worked as well as such arrangements worked, which was to say, not without cost, but with enough structure to make the cost manageable. He said his daughter had a sensitivity to words that he recognized the way you recognized a particular quality of light, not because you'd named it, but because your body knew it before your mind did. She would hear a word used incorrectly, not factually incorrectly, but wrongly, in the wrong register, deployed with the wrong weight, and visibly flinch. At 11, she read constantly and had opinions that were not opinions, but verdicts. He said he did not know whether to worry about this or celebrate it, and had concluded that the answer was both simultaneously, which was the same conclusion his own parents had reached about him, which did not make it more comfortable. She sounds, Alara said, like someone who will never sleep on 20 mattresses. No, he said, she won't. There was love in his voice that was not sentimental. It was the particular, clear-eyed love of a parent who saw their child accurately, without softening or hardening, and loved precisely that accurate version. He asked her if she had children. She said no. He did not ask the follow-up question that people sometimes asked, whether she had wanted them, whether the marriage had been part of a larger plan that had now been disrupted, because he was apparently not the kind of person who asked those follow-up questions. She was grateful for this in a way that told her something about how often those questions were asked and how much answering them cost. "What made you choose editing?" she asked. "Given what you've been saying about interiority, it seems like a strange choice for someone interested in the inside of things. Editing is the outside of things, the surface, the vessel. That's a false distinction," he said, and there was a mild, precise quality to his disagreement that she had come to recognize over the course of the evening. Not combative, but clear. Good editing is not about the surface. It's about finding the line between what the author intended and what the author achieved. That gap, that's where the interior is. A writer writes from a feeling toward an expression of that feeling, and the path between them is never perfectly straight, and sometimes what gets lost in the translation is exactly the thing that matters most. The editor's job is to feel that gap, to notice the bruise. Alara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So you are doing professionally what the Queen did with the pea." Oliver stared at her, and then he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that doesn't know it's coming until it's already happened. It transformed his face. The tension in the jaw she had noticed that morning released. His eyes, which had been thoughtful all evening, became briefly uncomplicated. "I have never thought of it that way," he said. "You spend your professional life devising tests to determine whether the thing is real. Without the subject's knowledge or consent," he said, "the amusement still present which does cast a new light on the ethics of it. And the writer bruises overnight and shows up the next morning with the evidence. And sometimes I put the pea in a cabinet, he said. Yes. He shook his head, smiling. That's really quite uncomfortably accurate. She was aware that she was smiling too. It was not a forced or social smile. It was the kind of smile that arrived because something had been genuinely amusing, and your face reported this honestly, and she noticed it the way you noticed a light coming on in a room you thought was empty. Outside, the garden had the particular arrested quality of early post-rain air. Everything soaked and still. The silver grass, the dark border of the hedgerow, the wet stone of the garden wall catching moonlight like a mirror that had been slowly losing its silver. It was the kind of scene that a painter would have to look at for a long time before knowing where to begin, because all of it was equally important. No center, no hierarchy, just the wet world glittering under the recovered moon. They had moved at some point from their separate armchair and fireplace ledge to the window seat at the eastern end of the room, the one that ran along the bottom of the tall window and looked out into the garden. They were sitting on opposite ends of it, facing the window, with perhaps 2 feet of dark upholstered space between them. This had happened without discussion, simply the result of 2 people gravitating toward the available light when the interior darkness of the room increased. Elara had her tea. She had accepted a cup when Delia made a pot before going up, and this one she was drinking while it was still warm. Oliver had a glass of water. The late hour and the quieted rain had shifted the feel of the conversation into something lower, slower, the particular register of talk that happens between 2 in the morning and 4. A register that has its own grammar, its own rules about what can and cannot be said. Tell me the rest of the story, she said. He looked at her. Which story? The princess and the pea. Tell me the rest of it. The part Anderson leaves out. Oliver turned back to the window, to the garden and the moon. She could see his reflection in the glass. A secondary Oliver, slightly transparent, imposed on the wet garden behind it. She wakes in the morning, he said. His voice had dropped into the story register. The particular gravity that voices took on when the speaker understood what they were doing. She wakes, and she is bruised, all of her, in the way of someone who has not slept, the bruise being distributed through the whole body when the body has not been permitted to rest, not merely localized to the place of contact. She is tender everywhere. She rises and dresses without assistance because she is the kind of woman who dresses herself, who has always been self-sufficient in the small daily necessities, even when she has been surrounded by people whose role was to assist her. She does not think of this as pride. She thinks of it as basic competence. But it is also a form of not wanting to be seen before she is ready to be seen. Elara turned to look at him. He was still looking at the window, at the garden. She comes downstairs, and the family is assembled for breakfast. There are eggs and bread, and the small formal rituals of a royal morning. And she is composed because she is always composed. Because composure is what she knows about herself, the way other people know about being tall or having a facility for music. She has spent her whole life composing herself. She does it automatically now. And the queen looks at her, the queen who designed the test, the queen who placed the pea, and asks, very simply, "How did you sleep?" He paused, and the princess thinks, I know. She knows about the pea. I don't know how I know, but I know. And what I say now is either the truth or a test of my willingness to tell the truth. And I have to decide. I have to decide if I trust this question. If I trust the room, if the discomfort of having been bruised by 20 mattresses pressed down, by 20 feather beds pressed down by one small pea, is worth the risk of saying so. And what does she decide? Alara asked. Her voice was very quiet. She tells the truth, he said. Not because it's the strategic move. It might not be. She can't know yet. But because she has been telling the truth about what she feels for so long, and having no one believe her, that the possibility of a single room in which it might be received, actually received, is worth the risk of being wrong about it. The garden glittered outside. The moon was nearly full. The wet grass held the light, and the queen believes her, Alara said. Yes, and the prince. Oliver was quiet for a moment. The prince, he said finally, is still learning what it means to believe someone. He knows he wants to. He knows that wanting to is a necessary part of it, but is not the whole thing. He's been told all his life that princesses were out there, real ones, true ones, and he's been told what the proof would look like. And now he has the proof, and it is more complicated than the proof he expected, because the proof required bruising her, and he did not design the test and had no say in its administration. And he is standing in a room with a woman who was bruised while he slept, and who is telling the truth about it. And he is discovering that receiving the truth is its own kind of skill, that it requires something of you, that you cannot simply stand in the presence of another person's honesty and be a spectator. You have to be capable of it. You have to be worth it. Alara set down her tea. The cup made a small sound on the sill. She looked at Oliver's reflection in the glass for a moment. The transparent second Oliver with the wet garden behind him. And then at the real one beside her. Is he? She asked. Oliver turned to look at her. The moonlight was sufficient. His face was open in the way it had been open earlier, but more so. Whatever the evening had been accumulating toward, it was here now, present and clear, neither of them pretending otherwise. That, he said, is the question the story is building toward and doesn't answer. I know, because the answer isn't available at the beginning of a thing. It's only available in the middle or the end. And you don't know which you're in until you're further in than you are now. Oh, yes, she said. The word yes contained several things. The acknowledgement that she understood what he was saying. The acknowledgement that she understood what he meant by it. The acknowledgement beneath both of those that she was aware, had been aware for most of the evening, in the way of being aware of the rain without consciously registering it, that something was in the process of beginning, and that beginning was not the same as certainty, and was also not the same as nothing. They sat at the window until the moon had moved enough to change the quality of light in the garden, until the silver began to gray, and the gray began to approach the blue that was not quite dawn, but was its announcement. They did not touch. This was not restraint. It was the natural progression of an evening that had been entirely about interior things, about the invisible registers of sensitivity and interiority. And it would have been wrong to have ended it with something as obvious and external as touch. There would be time, or there would not. This evening existed in its own bracket, complete. They talked about smaller things as the hour grew late. The kind of small things that only became possible after the large things had been addressed. The kind of conversation that was its own kind of intimacy. She told him about the city she lived in, and the cafe on her street where she went to work, and the way the barista knew her order without being asked, which she had always found both comforting and faintly alarming as an indicator of the narrowness of her routine. He told her about a book he had been editing for 8 months, a novel about a cartographer who mapped places that had never existed, and the author's conviction that invented geography was as true as actual geography, which was either metaphysically interesting or professionally useless, depending on how you looked at it. She told him about a walk she had taken the previous spring along a section of the South Downs Way, alone, 4 days, and how, on the third day, she had understood something about herself that she had been circling for years, but could only see when she was in motion over a long enough distance. He asked what she had understood. She said that she had been waiting for something she was going to have to stop waiting for and simply provide herself. He asked what the something was. She thought for a moment and then said, permission. A permission to what? He asked. To feel things without needing them corroborated. To trust my own perception of things as real and accurate, even when the people around me can't feel what I'm feeling. To not require external validation of my own interior experience as a condition of taking it seriously. He was quiet for a moment. Then, did you manage it? I'm working on it. I understand the concept. The embodiment is taking longer. He smiled. Most true things are like that. You understand it intellectually, and then you have to wait for the understanding to move down into the body. And the body is slower than the mind and less interested in arguments, and has to be convinced through accumulated experience rather than through reasoning. That's the difference between knowing you're safe and feeling safe, he said, or knowing someone loves you and feeling loved, or knowing a mattress is comfortable and being able to sleep in it. Yes, he said, or that. At some point, she did not check the time, did not want to. The exact hour seemed irrelevant, and the knowing of it would have made the night feel more finite than she wanted it to feel, she said. Tell me another story. He looked at her. What kind of story? One you haven't told anyone, she said. One you've been keeping. He looked out at the garden for a long moment. The gray blue before dawn had grown slightly brighter. The shapes of things were becoming more distinct. The specific forms of hedges and walls and garden furniture emerging from the dark like photographs in Developer. Slowly, from nothing into gradual specificity, he said, "There is a story I have been trying to write for 10 years and cannot write. It's not a story I can tell someone else to write, not a commission, not a manuscript I could recognize and edit when it arrived. It's mine, specifically, which is its own problem since I am not a writer and have no claim to be one. But the story keeps being there, in the way of something that requires your attention without being able to state its requirements clearly." "What is it about?" she asked. "A man who is very good at recognizing real things in other people's work, and very bad at knowing whether anything in his own life is real. Who has developed the professional habit of sensitivity, of feeling the P through 20 matrices of text, and has applied it to every external thing, and has been nearly entirely unable to apply it to his own interior, who has lived for a long time with the specific condition of knowing exactly where the bruises are in every story he touches, and being somehow anesthetized to the bruises in his own body." As she listened, outside, the first birds were beginning, tentative, exploratory. A single note, and then a response, and then a brief silence, and then something more sustained. And the story I want to tell, the one I have been trying to tell for 10 years and failing, is about when that condition ends, about the moment when the anesthesia wears off, about the specific morning when you wake up bruised after years of sleeping on mattresses that were pressing down on something, and you feel the bruise, and the bruise tells you something. "What does it tell you?" Elara asked. Oliver turned to look at her. The quality of the light was changing, the night becoming the earliest possible morning, the world recovering its colors from the darkness one by one. The gray wall, the green garden, the dark sky with its last stars, the window glass reflecting back the pale interior of the room, and the two people in it. That there's a P, he said, which sounds obvious, but after years of numbness, the presence of something small and specific and true, even if it's uncomfortable, is not nothing. It might be, actually, the beginning of something. She looked at him for a long moment. The birds were continuing their patient, particular work outside. The world reassembling itself from sound, which was the way it had always been done from the beginning of things. That's a good story, she said. I haven't written it yet. I know, but it's good. She went up to her room as the dawn arrived properly. Not the early gray announcement, but the actual arrival. The sky going from navy to violet to the specific pale gold that was early morning light on a day after rain. The cleanest, most rinsed version of light. The world scoured and renewed. Oliver stayed at the window. As she reached the doorway of the sitting room, she turned back, because something in her, that same sensitivity she had been talking about all night, the capacity to feel the P, told her she should look back. He was sitting at the window with the dawn coming in around him, looking out at the garden. He did not know she had turned back. Or perhaps he did, and was giving her the privacy of not knowing that he knew. Either way, the image stayed with her. A man sitting at a window in the first morning light after long rain. The garden green and wet, and silver behind him. The conversation they had been having still in the room around him, like weather. She went up the stairs, first step silent, second step the low moan, third step the sharp crack, and down the hall to her room. She stood at her own window for a moment, looking out at the eastern garden, which was a different garden from the western one, but had the same post-rain quality, everything clean and specific, each blade of grass distinct, the spider webs in the hedge catches full of water beads, and catching the early light like a lace made of something precious. She thought about the princess, not the constructed image of her, the beautiful girl in the illuminated story, the fairy tale figure, but the real one, the imagined real one, the one who had come to the castle in a storm, wanting nothing more than to come in out of the rain, who had slept badly and woken bruised, and told the truth about it and been believed, who was now, somewhere in the stories after, the official princess, named, validated, seated at the breakfast table with the queen who had tested her, and the prince who was learning what it meant to believe her. Was she happy? Was happiness the right word? Was she still feeling things? Was there still a P? And if so, was she permitted to mention it? And was the permission even necessary now that she had been proven? Or had the proving simply moved her into a different category of having to be careful? The questions were not rhetorical. They felt immediate and personal and slightly urgent, though she was 34 years old and had no castle and no queen and no prince, only a room at a friend's estate in the hills with the rain freshly over, and the dawn arriving, and a man downstairs at a window who had spent an evening talking about the things that mattered, which was itself a kind of proof, a kind of P, a small, specific, possibly important discomfort beneath the comfort of a very ordinary evening. She got into bed. She pulled the covers over herself. She lay looking at the ceiling, which was old plaster with a small crack running from the window toward the center, the kind of crack that had been there for years and was structural only in the sense that it was now part of the structure, indistinguishable from intention. She was not tired, or rather, she was tired in the way of someone who has been through something, not the empty fatigue of routine, but the particular weighted tiredness of having paid full attention to a long and important thing. The tiredness that meant you had been present had brought everything with you, had not protected yourself from the experience by being partly elsewhere. She lay there and listened to the birds, which were fully committed now, the morning chorus building itself note by note into something extravagant and unnecessary and entirely serious. She lay there and felt carefully, with the specific attention of someone who had been discussing sensitivity all night and was now attempting to practice what had been preached, what she felt. She felt awake. She felt a small and tentative and genuine warmth located somewhere in the chest, which was where the body stored things it did not yet have language for. She felt bruised in the precise and useful way, the way that told her something was there, something small and specific beneath the ordinary comfort of the evening, something her body had registered while her mind was busy with other business. She felt like a princess in the morning, not a fairy tale one, not a constructed one, the real kind, the kind who had come in out of the rain. The next morning, which was technically later the same morning, the hours between the conversation's end and the household's revival being fewer than either of them would have chosen, was bright and washed and smelling of fresh grass through every open window. Alara came downstairs to find Marcus in the kitchen, awake before everyone, as was apparently his habit, making coffee with the kind of focused attention he brought to everything. He looked at her when she came in and did not say anything about the hour or the look of someone who had not slept enough. He simply poured her a cup and put it on the kitchen table and went back to what he was doing. She sat at the table with the coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the garden, which was the western garden, which she had been looking at from a different angle earlier in the night. It looked different in morning light, less silver, more itself, the hedges green and the flagstones still dark with moisture, the garden furniture casting long horizontal shadows. Marcus sat down across from her with his own coffee after a while. He was the kind of person whose company required no performance. They sat in silence for several minutes, which was the exact right thing. "Good night," he asked eventually. Not prying, just asking. "Very," she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. "The stories were good," she said. "They always are on nights like this." Nights like this meaning rain nights, he said. Nights when the weather won't let anyone go anywhere. When there's nothing for it but to be where you are with who you're with and say things you might not say if there were easier options. She thought about this. It was true that there was something about enforced enclosure, not the claustrophobic kind, but the gentle, insistent kind. The rain saying stay, 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 that permitted a different quality of conversation. The option of departure, available in ordinary circumstances, had a way of keeping everything slightly provisional. When departure wasn't an option, something in the conversation sat down properly. "Rain as permission," she said. "Yes," Marcus said, with the expression of a man who had thought about this before. "Or rain as structure. The story needs a container. Rain is a container." She thought of the princess again, coming to the castle in the storm, and the storm being what made the encounter possible. No storm, no wet girl at the gate. No wet girl at the gate, no test. No test, no proof. No proof, no story. The rain had not been incidental. The rain had been the thing that made the thing possible. The storm was the story's necessary condition, not its setting. She said this to Marcus, who received it with the quiet pleasure of a man who liked ideas. They talked about it for a while. The way stories used, whether not as backdrop, but as causality. The way certain stories could only happen in certain weather. How you could sometimes understand what a story was really about by asking what would be lost if you removed the weather from it. Felix came downstairs in a state of cheerful disarray and made himself espresso and ate 3 pieces of toast standing at the counter, and asked what they were talking about, and was told and said with genuine delight, "That's completely true, and I'd never thought of it." And they talked about it more, and it was good. The way mornings after good evenings could be good, not the same quality, not the same intensity, but continuous with it. The conversation picking up where it had left off in a different register. Nora appeared and made tea and was very quiet and looked at the garden with the expression of someone who had resolved something overnight and was now seeing the world with the adjusted vision of a person who has made a decision. She didn't say what the decision was, and no one asked. Delia came down and immediately began moving through the kitchen with the focused energy of someone who had a plan for breakfast, pulling things from the refrigerator and cupboards, issuing cheerful instructions. The kitchen filled with the smell of butter and toast and eggs. Marcus put music on something that was exactly right for the morning, something that had the same quality as the light through the window, warm and unhurried. Oliver came downstairs last. He was dressed and shaved and presented in all external respects as someone who had slept adequately. She recognized the performance because it was the same one she herself had made, though she had made it for similar reasons, not deception, but just the ordinary self-assembly of someone who preferred to arrive rather than to appear to have emerged. He came into the kitchen and accepted the coffee Marcus handed him and sat at the table. He sat at the opposite end from where she was sitting, and this too was correct. The right distance, not the exaggerated distance of 2 people pretending the night hadn't happened presumptuous closeness of two people claiming more than had actually been established. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. There was a moment, just a moment, brief enough to be missed by everyone else in the room, which was full of the motion and noise of breakfast being made, in which something was exchanged that did not have a name yet, and did not need one yet, the nomming being premature, the thing itself being sufficient at this stage of its existence. Then Delia put a plate of eggs in the middle of the table and said, "Eat," in the tone of a woman who had fed people she loved for long enough to have stopped asking and started telling. And everyone ate. Later that day, the afternoon, the sun properly out now, and the garden steaming gently in its post-rain warmth. Alara sat in the garden on one of the stone benches and read, or held a book and looked at it, which was a form of reading that involved the words occasionally, and the thoughts between the words more continuously. The book was a collection of essays about folklore, which she had found on the shelves of the sitting room the previous afternoon, and had carried out to the garden with the half intention of finding the section on Andersen, which she suspected was there. She had not looked at it when she planned to. The rain had arrived, and then the evening had arrived, and the essays had waited with the patience of things that could afford to wait, because the right time was coming. She found the Andersen section. It was written by a folklorist she hadn't heard of, a woman who had spent her career in Copenhagen studying the Nordic tale traditions, and she read with the particular pleasure of someone finding in a scholarly text exactly the preoccupation that had been living in her head, the feeling of simultaneous recognition and expansion. Yes, this, and also more than I knew. The folklorist argued that the princess and the pea was, in Andersen's hands, a deliberately antithetical fairy tale, a tale that appeared to celebrate the detection of breeding and refinement, but was actually a critique of the test culture it depicted. Anderson, she wrote, was himself a man of extreme sensitivity born into poverty, a man who spent his adult life being tested by a society that required proof of his worthiness, a man who understood deeply what it meant to be told your perception of your own suffering was either evidence of your delicacy or evidence of your excess. When he wrote the queen who placed the pea, he was not celebrating her, he was examining her. The test worked, yes, but the test should not have been necessary, and the girl should not have had to bleed to prove she was real. Elara sat with this for a while. The sun moved across the garden. A bee negotiated the lavender with the focused efficiency of something that had a job and was doing it. She thought about what it meant to be a real thing, not in the fairy tale sense, not a real princess as opposed to a false one, but in the more general sense. To be a real thing as opposed to a constructed thing, a performed thing, a thing assembled from what was required by the rooms and situations you moved through. To be in contact, genuine contact, with your own interior. To trust what you felt when you felt it, rather than submitting it to external verification first. She had spent a great deal of her adult life, most of it, honestly, in a practice of self-translation, feeling something, then assessing whether it was legitimate, then editing it before expression, then watching for confirmation that the expressed version had been received as intended. It was an exhausting process, this translation work. It was also very familiar. It had the comfort of long habit. It was, she recognized, the mattress, all 20 of them, all 400 layers of feather and down that she had been sleeping on, and under which something small and specific and true had been pressing for a long time. The question was not whether the pea was there. She knew it was, had known, really, for some years now, with increasing clarity. The question was what she was going to do about it. Or perhaps the question was simpler than that. Perhaps the question was whether she would, when someone asked how she had slept, tell the truth about it. She found Oliver in the library in the late afternoon, which was where she had first seen him, which felt like the kind of symmetry that stories used intentionally and life used without planning, but with an accuracy that was its own kind of intention. He was reading again, the same held close manner, both hands, the slight tilt toward the window light. He looked up when she came in. The garden's beautiful after rain, she said, which was not what she had come to say, but was true and a reasonable way to start. I noticed, he said. He had apparently been in the garden earlier. There was still the ghost of outdoor air about him, the particular freshness that the scoured post-rain world had been distributing all day. She looked at the spines of the books on the nearest shelf, old travel narratives, maps turned into prose. She thought of the cartographer in the novel he was editing, the one who mapped places that had never existed. She pulled one out, a Victorian account of a journey through Persia, and turned it over in her hands. I read something this afternoon, she said. An essay about Anderson, about the story, and it argued that Anderson was critiquing the test, not endorsing it. That the whole point was the wrongness of requiring a person to bleed to be believed. Oliver set his book down. He had the look of someone putting one thing aside to give full attention to another. That's a compassionate reading. Is it the right one? I think it's one of the right ones. Stories have the capacity for multiple right readings. That's part of what makes them right. She put the travel narrative back on the shelf, turned to face him. He was watching her with the steady, dark-eyed attention she had become familiar with overnight. The attention that was not appraising. It was not looking for something to confirm or deny, but simply present, fully and specifically directed. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." Last night was, I don't have a word for what last night was. It was conversation, obviously. It was stories. It was the particular thing that happens in a room with good people and rain outside and time to actually go somewhere in the conversation rather than staying near the surface. All of that. But it was also, she paused. She was editing herself. She recognized the edit. She stopped editing. "It mattered to me. You mattered to me." In the specific way of a person who talks to you and you feel, for the duration of it, completely real. Oliver was very still. The quality of his stillness was not the stillness of discomfort. She was attuned to that difference now, had become attuned to it over the course of the night. But the stillness of full attention, of someone taking something in entirely. He said, "I came here this weekend because Delia invited me, and I had nothing specific requiring my presence elsewhere, and I thought it would be pleasant and familiar and easy. I did not expect," he stopped. He was doing the same thing she had done. She recognized editing, then catching the edit. He started again. "I did not expect to sit at a window until dawn with someone and talk about peas and fairy tales and feel, at the end of it, bruised in a way that was accurate, not painful in the bad sense, accurate in the way that tells you you've been in contact with something real." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the library window, the afternoon sun was long and golden over the western garden. The particular quality of late daylight that made everything seem slightly more serious than it was, slightly more significant. The light that painters chased and photographers waited for. The light that fell on things and made them more entirely themselves. "I live in York," he said. "You live in Bristol," she said. "That's 3 hours, 2.5 on a good day. That's the kind of information that is either a problem or a description of the situation, he said, depending on what one intends to do about it. What do you intend to do about it? He looked at her for a moment, and in his face was the expression of a man who had spent some years being very good at knowing where the bruises were in other people's stories, and was now tentatively and with the particular care of someone handling something they recognized as valuable, attempting to locate them in his own. I intend, he said, to ask if you would like to have dinner next week in a city that is convenient for both of us, somewhere between York and Bristol, which is approximately Nottingham, which is not the most romantic possible answer, but has the advantage of being geographically accurate. She smiled. She felt the smile as a physical event, a specific warmth. The bruise below the 20 mattresses of the last several years, making itself quietly and precisely known. Yes, she said, I'd like that. The story does not end here, because stories that are true do not end at the moment of beginning. They end much later, or they don't end at all, or they end somewhere you didn't expect them to end, with a detail you wouldn't have thought to include if you were designing the ending rather than discovering it. What can be said in the manner of Anderson's brief and knowing concluding paragraph is this: they had dinner in Nottingham the following Thursday. The restaurant was nothing special, but the conversation was. They walked afterward by the river in the dark, and she told him something she had not told anyone, and he received it exactly as it deserved to be received, which was not with answers, but with the particular quality of listening that is itself a form of answer. They had dinner in York the month after that, and she saw his flat, which was full of books and had a window that looked out over the minster. And she stood at that window for a long time in the evening light, while he made something in the kitchen and thought about the cartographer who mapped places that had never existed and whether they had existed anyway, and what it meant for a place to be real. There were phone calls and messages, and the particular practice of two people learning each other at a distance, which was different from learning each other in person and had its own vocabulary, its own rhythms and difficulties. There were evenings when the distance was the obvious and present fact. There were mornings when it was simply the geography of the situation, neither good nor bad, simply true. There were, over the months, moments of the particular discomfort that Oliver had described, the bruise that was accurate rather than painful in the bad sense, the moments of feeling something through the layers of ordinary comfort and not knowing immediately what it meant or whether to mention it. She mentioned it. This was the part she was working on, the embodiment of the understanding she had arrived at on the South Downs Way. The permission, practiced daily, to trust her own perception of things without requiring corroboration. First, he felt things too, and said so with increasing ease, the anesthesia wearing off in the slow way of things that have been maintained for a long time and take a long time to stop. There were evenings, usually late evenings, the particular late evening register that had been established that first night at the estate, when he would say something that had the quality of something being brought up from depth, something he had not said to someone before, and she would receive it the way he had received hers, as itself, directly, without translation. Delia watched this with the quiet satisfaction of someone who did not take credit for things she had only partially intended, but was not above being pleased about them. Marcus said nothing, which was his way of saying everything. The P was not in a cabinet of curiosities. It was not displayed, not made into proof, not institutionalized, it remained itself, small, specific, actual, and its only significance was the significance of things that are real, the capacity through sheer existence to be felt. Alara kept the book of folklore essays. She returned to the Anderson section several times over the following year, and each time found something in it she had not found before, which is the sign of a text that is keeping something in reserve for the reader, not withholding exactly, but waiting for the reader to be ready for the next layer. As she wrote in the margins with a pencil, and in several places had small arguments with the folklorist, and in at least one place conceded a point and wrote, "She's right," in careful letters beside the sentence that had been right. Oliver read those marginalia one evening in Bristol, sitting in her apartment, which was by then familiar enough to him that the barista on the street had begun to recognize him too, adding him to the existing order with a small and knowing nod, and said that the conversation in the margins was better than some manuscripts he'd read, which was either the highest compliment he could offer or a reflection of the manuscripts. And she said she thought it was probably both. But the story is really the night of the rain. That is the story. Everything that comes after is consequence, unfolding, the season after the initial season, real and important, and its own territory, but not the story itself. The story is the sitting room at the Whitmore estate, with the fire built high, and the rain performing its patient work on the windows, and 6 people in the particular warmth of a room that has been made real by the quality of attention its inhabitants have brought to it. The story is Felix with his hands moving as he talks, and Nora on the rug with her charcoal pencil, and Marcus with his bowl of mushrooms and his architectural quietness, and Delia at the center of it all, making the space in which things could happen The story is a man who asks a simple question about a fairy tale everyone knows, and then follows the question to where it actually leads, which is not to a simple answer, but to a conversation that knows its own way and does not need managing. The story is a woman at a window in a borrowed room with cold tea and a particular quality of absence in her interior. And then the same woman at a different window at the end of the same night, with the dawn arriving and the birds starting their daily project, and something in her chest that was small and specific and true, pressing gently through the layers. The story is the rain, which did not fall to set the mood or provide atmosphere or give the evening its necessary enclosure. Though it did all of these things, and gladly, the rain fell because it was that season, because the pressure had been building all day, because the hills and the valley and the river were all participating in a pattern that required this specific form of water on this specific night. And the falling had nothing to do with anyone in the house, and everything to do with the way the world works, which is to say, without regard for timing, without consultation, simply as itself, persistently, in the only direction it knows to go. And the people inside, responding to the rain, had made a container for things that needed containing. And in that container, in that warm and story-lit room with the fire and the wine and the late hours and the particular permission of being far from ordinary life, something had been felt for the first time in a long time by people who had learned, for various reasons, to sleep through the sensation. The P, small and specific and precise, beneath everything. There, it is late. The fire is down to coals. The rain has stopped, or will stop, or is in the process of stopping. The transition so gradual that the moment of its ending cannot be identified with certainty, only known after the fact. are breaking. There are stars somewhere in the estate, in one of the rooms that smell of cedar wood and old books. A woman is lying in bed looking at the ceiling, feeling something small and true. Somewhere in the long sitting room, in the window seat that looks out over the western garden, a man is watching the moon clear the last of the storm clouds and thinking about a story he has not yet written, but will. The garden is wet. The grass holds its memory of the rain. The spider webs are jeweled. Somewhere far away, in a cabinet in a museum, a pea, or the idea of a pea, or the story of a pea, which amounts to the same thing, rests in its case, as it may still be seen to this day, if you know what you are looking for. And the princess, in her room in the castle, in the morning that comes after every night, has bruises. And the bruises are evidence. And the evidence is exactly what she thought it was. She was right about what she felt. She was right. She has always been right about what she felt. This is the story. This has always been the story. And now sleep.